So in the last episode of this particular part one and part two series, I talked about how, well, I left off how the UFC is basically like an ant and a roach in an atomic bomb situation. And what exactly do I mean by that? I think it sounds exactly as what it means. When a nuclear bomb comes into a city or anything like that, ants and roaches are one of the first people that survive it because of just the mechanisms of how they're built, the way that they're small, the way that they have their foundation and that particular attribute setting that allows them to mitigate any danger when it comes to atomic bomb situations. That's what the UFC is in a nutshell when we're talking about lawsuits. And this particular part two is going to be titled Settlement. Part one was the lawsuit. This is the settlement. So the UFC knows that they have a lot at stake when it comes to the possible billions that they're going to lose. So what exactly does any formidable, any elusive company that has strived for couples of years in terms of different struggles, different situations of when they first bought the UFC with Frank and his brother, the Fertitta brothers, right? They were on a verge of selling the UFC. Why? Because of the fact that they thought that it wasn't going to sell and that the 2 million that they had bought from the original owners, they just were not getting the investments. And then lo and behold, 2016, what happens? They go and sell it to Endeavor, basically an agency company that runs the UFC's talent pool and now runs the UFC altogether with the different conglomerates of media outlets that they're affiliated with. You got Emmanuel, who owns the UFC along with other movie ventures and other sports agencies and Hollywood agencies at that. So that's what you have going on with the UFC and the type of powerful owners and powerful resources that they have in the current moment of time. So now you got to understand that they're going to have a strategy, just like what I mentioned in part one with Vince McMahon. What is it that he always does when he has beef with his talent? Well, it never really lasts for one reason or another. And the reason why it doesn't last is because of the fact that, let's just face it, Vince McMahon is a person that thinks about business first over personal vendettas. Dana White is the same thing. You look at Ben Askren. Before he signed Ben Askren, what happened? They were talking trash to each other, saying that, oh, this guy's never going to fight in the UFC, and calling Dana all these types of names, derogatory statements that he's made against him. I'm talking about Ben Askren, and then guess what happens? He goes and gets signed, fights Robbie Lawler, and then gets knocked out by Jorge Masvidal. And then he goes and gets beat by Damian Maia, and that's the end of it. But nonetheless, Dana White worked with him, and they had beef, supposedly. So the same thing with Dana White. Now, this is not beef in any stretch of the imagination. This is just what I owe you and what you owe me, and now I'm going to get the Supreme Court to make you pay up. And what are they going to do? They're going to do the smart thing, which is just have a settlement. Now, I know that's a very lackluster answer and not a very exciting or dramatic as the title in the video, the way that the video is titled. It's not really all that dramatic, right? But it's the reality of what goes on in real life. See, in real life, we all like to think that this person has his downfall. It's coming. This guy is on the roll of losing everything because he's exhibiting A and he's exhibiting B and he's exhibiting C and D and everything in between. Well, the reality is that you just don't know what is going to happen, but then there are some things that you do know that are going to happen, like the status quo of everything that you know is going to stick constantly. The consistency of what sticks and the consistency of what doesn't. The consistency of failure and then the lack of consistency when it comes to, let's say, dealing with having long-term success. Well, the UFC is proven to be a commodity that can sustain long-term success. You've seen what they did in the pandemic. They were the only game show in town, and how were they able to pull that off? With the right strategy, the right plan, the right perseverance, more importantly, for them to be able to pull that off. So I know it's not the most exciting answer that I can give you when it comes to what's going to happen with this lawsuit, which is why I titled the part 2, The Settlement, because that's literally what they're going to do, is they're going to settle. And you know what? With a lot of these athletes that have this moral superiority in terms of how they look at everything, oh, I'm doing this all for the fighters, or this and that. Even Jake Paul himself, he goes out there and says, well, I'm doing this for the fighters, or this and that. But then, you know, other situations come about where you kind of think like, well, okay, is he just saying that? Or are those just phrase words that sound nice to put on a headline in, you know, in some kind of MMA or boxing article? Perhaps. But the reality is that you got to take one thing into consideration when it comes to the UFC, right? It's going to be very difficult to topple them because of the long-term success that they've had. And by the way, they really have monopolized MMA in a way where it's almost like you can really do nothing about it. But we'll wait and see and what happens after this. Now, next thing I've noticed, this morning I was watching Sway Universe, which is a hip-hop podcast regarding all topics of hip-hop music, urban culture, sports, in particular boxing, when it comes to Terrence Crawford with their recent guests. And Terrence Crawford was asked by one of the Sway guys, and I thought this was one of the most brilliant questions that they put out there in the entire show. Not to say that they didn't have any brilliant questions, but this one stood out the most. He asked, did you start feeling sorry for him, and if so, when? Bud Crawford answered something to the effect, well, man, in that situation, I'm like Drago. If he, you know, DIEs, he DIEs. And I thought, wow, you know what? I think this is very refreshing, because I think it gives people a different insight into what they really need to understand about how the majority of fighters think. And there are fighters out there that are very outward about it, that will tell you, they will let you know and hurt you if, let's say, you somehow cross them in any kind of way that they deem threatening or disrespectful or anything to that extent, right? They will go off on you. There's guys that are like that, but then there's guys that like are George St. Pierre's of the world. Anthony Joshua, earlier in his career, when he wanted to somehow show that he was more of, let's say, an inclusive type of character, somebody who was for everybody, somebody who was the beacon of multiculturalism. But nonetheless, the majority of these fighters, and as you even seen with the current attitude with Anthony Joshua, their MO is to go out there and hurt you and to dominate and to win at all costs. You look at Kobe Bryant's mentality, the late Kobe Bryant, when he was alive. How was this guy like? He was very competitive, was one of the first guys to enter the gym, enter practice, and then was the last guys to leave. His workouts and work ethic was just in an absolute insane level that anybody in that pro level could not match. But nonetheless, that is what it takes to be number one and to be the best. And sometimes that has a drawback. And one of the drawbacks of that is sometimes a lot of people are not going to interpret you the correct way, or sometimes you just don't have the BS to deal with anybody. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why I got into fighting is because even if it's amateur or pro MMA or whatever, if you get into fighting, one of the reasons why you do it is because you want to prove to the world that you're the baddest guy in the world. You feel you have something that nobody else has. You know those long stretches of workout sessions that you do that you know that nobody else is willing to put up or deal with. Only you know the reality of that and the reality of what it is that you are capable of. And you want to show that to the world. So that's the reason why you go out there and compete. And sometimes some of the drawbacks of that personality is you're not going to be very well liked. You're going to be misunderstood. People are going to look at you in a different way. They're going to think that you're mean. They may not be able to relate to you because they can't understand the level of tenacity that you feel inside, the level of energy that you want to exert out. Maybe perhaps you're just in a different energy level than they are. Obviously, if you're training multiple times in a span of a day, you're just going to have a different outlook in life and different reactions and different ways of how you're going to approach things just based on the fact that, let's say, you have endorphins and the guy that, you know, didn't work out in the same amount of time that you did today or train that hard is not going to feel that way, right? So it's just a lot of things that a lot of people are not going to be able to relate. But nonetheless, one of the things that is really unrelatable is the fact that as fighters, a lot of people are just not going to like the kind of responses that we have when it comes to, let's say, how we're going to deal with an opponent, how we feel about an opponent. To some people, they may view it as sociopathic. Some people may just do it in a way of just playing a role to try to sell wolf tickets or to try to sell merchandises or pay-per-view. And these are realities that you have to understand. And there are guys in the fight game that are really like that are really psychotic and that have this insane drive to want to hurt people. Those guys are a reality too. So all these different spectrums, I think, are very important to understand and look at when it comes to the mixed martial arts and the boxing landscape. Obviously, there's a lot of guys that we want to market and say, yeah, he's clean cut, he says all the right things and does all the right things for people. But then there are guys out there that are just absolute animals and that will have absolutely no BS about, you know, with anything. So I think a lot of people are going to be turned off by what Terence Crawford said, but at the same time, Terence Crawford right now is on a high status in terms of the where he has catapulted in his celebrity, right? Obviously, doing Sway has mentioned it. He was one of the first guests during the pandemic to come in during Zoom to talk and whatnot, which was great for Terence Crawford. It was a good way for him to go out there and stay relevant. A lot of people would always complain about the fact that he just wasn't a very marketable person. Just didn't talk a lot. Well, guess what? Neither did Ivan Drago. But what is it that about Ivan Drago that we find very intriguing as a character? The fact that he's menacing, the fact that he's cold-blooded, the fact that he's going to take you out with no mercy and no reservations about how you feel or what you did to his friend, or, you know, or what he did to your friend, or things of that nature. And obviously I'm talking about the Apollo Creed storyline in Rocky IV. But then now we're starting to open layers with Terence Crawford and think, you know what, this is the kind of character that we either like or don't like. But nonetheless, that's kind of the same thing as what I'm going to segue into Sean O'Malley as the main event with UFC 292. Now, obviously, he's got the blessings of Snoop Dogg, Tekashi 6ix9ine. He's a big star, and I can really see him get out-wrestled in this particular fight. Why? Because of the fact that as much as I want to see him win, and the fact that I think that he's going to be great for the sport of MMA and the sport of in the company of the UFC in terms of what he can bring with his star power, I just don't think that he has enough wrestling for him to be able to withstand the likes of Aljamain Sterling. You got to understand something when it comes to wrestling. Wrestling is one of those things where you have to constantly work at it, right? And if you're missing years of doing it, I think it's just going to show in this fight. Now, how do I see this fight? I really see this by a decision with Aljamain Sterling. Obviously, Sean O'Malley has done all the right things, created this different sleeping patterns of research that he's had scientists test him on. He's doing all these innovative stuff as a modern fighter to really innovate his game to the next level. But that's what's going to make him hard to beat. But the skills of Aljamain Sterling is going to be a little bit too much. I'm going to go with Aljamain Sterling by decision on this one. Weili Zhang versus Amanda Lemos. I'm going to go with Weili Zhang. Weili Zhang has this torque power where she can just knock you out easily just based on the fact that she has these firepower that comes from her hips, from her kicks, from her punches, and it's quite devastating. It's very Mike Tyson-like. Very few female fighters have that, not even Ronda. Obviously, Ronda used a lot of hip movements from the judo tosses that she would do to take her opponents down to the ground, and then, of course, the ground submission that she would lay afterwards with an arm bar and whatnot. But with Weili Zhang, it's more of a firepower from the stand-up kickboxing department, and I think that she's going to really dominate in that particular department right there. And I think she dominates most girls in that department, other than Rose, obviously, and some others. Maybe she'll have trouble with Joanna, but she's beat Joanna. But other than that, she's a firecracker when it comes to the striking department. She's going to knock out Amanda Lemos in this one. Ian Machado Gary versus Neil Magny. Neil Magny stepping in as a late notice. This is a great way for Ian Gary to get introduced to the top 10. I can see Ian Gary having the better striking here. Neil Magny is a little bit over the tooth. He's been fighting for a long time. He's up there in terms of like being a modern Donald Cerrone, or right up there with Donald Cerrone in terms of having all these fights, taking all these short notices, just like what he does with this one. Neil Magny is going to be very difficult to deal with in a clinch, but I can see Ian Gary use his anti-clinching technique to try to get away from it, or if at worst, if he gets taken down, or if he takes down Neil Magny himself, I can see him use a lot of the jiu-jitsu that he's worked on while he was down in Brazil with his wife's family and whatnot, while he was down there training, getting some jiu-jitsu in on top of the kickboxing and striking prowess that he has going on. Marlon Chito Vera versus Pedro Munoz. I'm going to go with Pedro Munoz on this one. Marlon Vera has had a whole lot of damages all throughout his career, but I can see Pedro Munoz edging out a decision on this one. Chris Weidman versus Brad Tavares. I'm going to go with Brad Tavares on this one. Chris Weidman has had a long injury going into this fight and has had a long layoff coming from that tragedy of a fight with his leg getting broken in the Uriah Hall rematch. Obviously, he beat Uriah Hall in the regional scene, and then they came and rematched in the twilight of their UFC career, at least with the likes of Uriah Hall, because then he moved on to influencer boxing after that. I can see Brad Tavares breaking him down with kicks and possibly getting a finish with this one, if not with a decision. I can't see Chris Weidman being able to take Brad Tavares down. I think the injury is going to be a problem for him. Gregory Rodriguez versus Dennis Tolian is going to be in that one. Austin Hubbard taking on Kurt Holloway. Those guys were in the Tough House with Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler. And how about Conor McGregor announcing that him and Chandler are going to fight in December? Andre Petroski taking on Gerald Meerschaert. I could see Gerald Meerschaert getting a submission win in that one, and probably a decision. Andrea Lee taking on Natalia Silva. Korean Silva versus Myrna Moroz. Now, sorry, I didn't really give you any predictions for the other card. I just basically gave you Chris Weidman, Marlon Vera, Ian Gary, Wang Jie Lee, and Amanda Lemos, and then the main event with Aljamain Sterling and Sean O'Malley. I don't know too much about the other fighters. Obviously, I'm probably going to do a live somewhere during the week and talk more about these fights and do a little bit more research on these fighters. But that is my official prediction for UFC 292. And this is the conclusion of the part 2 regarding UFC in Trouble lawsuit part 1, part 2, the settlement. Because when it comes to court cases like this, when it comes to the powerful and the rich, they're always going to bring out the settlement, and the greed inside people are always going to accept it. And we'll probably have more on that in a separate podcast or in a separate content. Enjoy the fights.